People will argue that inflame yourself with prayer isn't a grimoire injunction, but I find it more effective when there is a bit of inflaming going on. And the language of some invocations is much more passionate than others. Someone forgot to tell the author of the tricks that invocations are meant to be dull.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we are so elated to welcome back to the podcast magician, author, scholar, and grimoiric firebrand, Jake Stratton Kent. Jake has been a goetic magician since 1972, making more than 40 years of continuous goetic practice. Jake's practical work integrates the magical papyri, grimoires such as the Grimorium Verum in African traditional religions, and Jake's interest in magic spans the ancient, the medieval, the Renaissance, and the modern eras, as well as stretching from the West to the Middle East and, crucially, the New World. In this episode, Jake returns to the podcast to discuss his groundbreaking reconceptualization of grimoiric magic in his latest tome, The Sworn and Secret Grimoire from Hadean Press. And Jake, to me, is not only a magician with decades of experience, he's also an author who simultaneously makes new and fascinating connections to the deep past with the history of goetic practice, such as in his wonderful tome Geosophia, the Argo of Magic, but also, simultaneously, Jake blazes a trail into the future of magical and esoteric ceremonial magical practice by challenging us all to consider what even is the grimoiric tradition? What does it mean to forge or to reforge an authentic, idiosyncratic magical practice from the myriad of new grimoiric research and publications dotting the landscape in the last 20 years? What are the key elements that make magical ritual work? How can we keep the tradition and elements of the grimoires without having them become petrified into robotic rituals that do not achieve successful contact with spirits and results? Well, Jake is the perfect person to ask about these questions and to explore so many issues which he covers in the Sworn and Secret Grimoire. And by the way, you can also support Jake and his wonderful research and insights on patreon.com/Jake Stratton Kent. And also, a huge thank you to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your excellent questions for Jake. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome back Jake Stratton Kent. Jake Stratton Kent, thank you so much for coming back on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Oh, it's a pleasure as always, Alexander.
You are such a rebel as always. Here we are, right? Just getting comfortable, settling into our armchairs, maybe getting ready in the coming weeks for a leisurely reading of one grimoire or another. And then here you go again, shaking everything up and challenging us to think about grimoiric practice and, as you always say, urging us to get our fingers burned with direct experience. So can you share, Jake, when it comes to this tome, this Sworn and Secret Grimoire, what was the genesis of this tome? What made you say, I have to write this?
Well, firstly, it's hardly a tome. I'm fanning myself with a copy at the moment. You know, like a lot of real grimoires, it's quite slim. But its genesis, well, I've been doing a lot of writing for the last few years that hasn't been published because I've not been sure where it's going. Literally, sometimes it's taken me to Central Europe to check things out from a brand new perspective, constantly writing, but not having any idea what the final form is going to be. And then the idea of bringing out a copy of Jariel's slightly represented came along, and I thought, well, that'll actually help get at least some of what I've been writing out of the way. It became the leading element of a planned series where, rather than trying to write one book, I'm going to write two or three that are interconnected. So, Sworn and Secret Grimoire is a book in its own right, but it's also a preparation for the rest of the series. Like if you can wrap your head around talismanic magic being very similar to evocation. I mean, the the ritual processes are very, very similar. If you wrap your head around that and work with the talismans from the Petit Albert, etc., then you'll be ready for a next step in the next volume, which moves away from what looks like planetary magic, but actually isn't, into something that's more stellar. And so it will develop, and I can finally get all of this material out of the way in a fashion that's going to be coherent, hopefully. That's how it happened, more or less.
This is collectively known as the Night School.
Some readers will spot some continuity with Pandemonium as well, things I say about the days of the week and their demons and what it symbolizes. There's traces of that in Pandemonium, but it's due to develop a lot in this series. And yes, it's a very nocturnal emphasis, partly because it concerns the stars and planets, which you can only really see at night, generally speaking. There's a very sublunar emphasis as well. I mean, you're dealing with spirits who are resident here, and not even assuming that there are spirits resident anywhere else but here. So, yeah, that's sort of different from the usual Solomonic or Kabbalistic frame of reference. You know, it's all in the here and now, moon downwards to the underworld.
You really focus, Jake, on practicality and efficacy in this specific tome, as you say, this first volume of the Night School. Can you talk about why specifically take this approach, and especially why is it so important to boil things down to their essentials, especially when we are surrounded by, it seems, a shipyard of just grimoires and traditions and new translations and new updates? I mean, why is it so important to bring things back to practicality and efficacy?
Well, I think a lot of people want to compose their own rituals. Nothing wrong with that. That's extremely traditional, but having an idea of what a ritual is in the first place, what are the stages of ritual, is going to be very helpful. I mean, it's a perfectly natural inclination to, for instance, want to abandon the so-called Judeo-Christian elements in the grimoires, but replacing them with components that match the original job is going to be useful. And I mean, it's not just for the sake of iconoclasm. The purposes for which we do spells and rituals have changed substantially since, say, the times of the magical papyri or various phases of the grimoire tradition. We've got motor cars, electronic goods, and all sorts of other stuff that spells might legitimately involve or concern. So being able to compose anew, rather than looking for a spell to fix your car in a grimoire that's written before the industrial era, it's kind of necessary. It's common sense that you want to know how to compose effectively without abandoning the principles, because that's going to involve reinventing the wheel. And when talking of wheels, you can't build a motorbike without knowing a bit about mechanics. So rituals are the same. The mechanics are what's important. Magic is a technology, first and foremost.
What is the secret grimoire of Turiel, for those who may not know? And why did you choose this specific forgery, quote unquote, for the ritualistic framework of the book itself? Can you just give the listeners a little backstory or maybe some of the broad strokes?
I have worked with it myself in the past and found, the fact that it was slim, portable, concise. And you didn't have to think about angels and demons particularly. It was fairly obviously for a different class of spirits altogether. In fact, they belong to a different classification altogether. It just seemed like a good idea this year. But let's put out a grimoire of Turiel. I just didn't know how much I was biting off when the initial idea occurred. Because there are substantial problems with grimoire of Turiel. What it looks like it's going to give you isn't quite what it delivers. And I wanted it to deliver. So it turned into a reforging.
You reforged. You took from that specific grimoire, that specific manual, a ritualistic structure, and then you forged your own idiosyncratic work. How did you do this? Because I think there might be some listeners out there, Jake, who are saying, I might have an affinity for a specific grimoire, but I have no idea how to go about drawing out the key elements and putting things together. So what is the process of forging and reforging all about?
Well, in my own experience, initially it wasn't with Stephen Skinner stroke Dr. Rudd's 6 stages, but with a a very comparable 6 stages in magic and theory and practice. And I gradually came to realise that these 2 accounts of so-called classical magic were identical. I mean, it's possible, very possible, that Crowley got to Rudd before Steve Skinner did. But maybe there was some other route. But yeah, back in the 1970s, I was using this skeletonic structure. I literally had glyphs for the various stages. If there was a ritual I wanted to use, but it was missing components, or they assumed you already knew enough to put them in, or somehow they got missed out, then I could restructure it. I'd take the same kind of component and slot it into my schema. Write it against the corresponding glyph until I got all the parts. And I learned to be fairly flexible about this, and I also took it for granted that composing invocations, for instance, was perfectly legit. You just needed to know how invocations worked. I've worked a lot with the Laden Papyrus and planetary magic, or apparent planetary magic from the Pictrix, and various other places, which all involved essentially, say, 7 gods or angels or demons, and with apparent planetary classification, although, of course, the planetary hours don't really represent anything astrological, they represent something else. It was a fairly straightforward pattern, both as the entities who can be worked in 7-fold classification and the grimoire structure. I mean, they're quite flexible, and components can be taken from other places. I didn't get on particularly well with Arabic angels, for instance. It didn't seem like I had much business going there, but then there's invocations in the Pictrix which don't mention the Arab angels. They go straight for old pagan gods. But they're obviously the same kind of ritual. The stages are the same. The colour correspondences, etc., are all very much the same, quite generic, despite the cultural, quite major cultural differences. So going from those grimoires, whether they're from a Muslim background or a Catholic background or whatever, going to a pagan background is really not very difficult. You just have to understand the mechanics, as I've already said. So, yeah, it always seemed natural to me. It was habitual. I probably got rid of hundreds of pieces of paper with this, series of glyphs and, where I mixed the components from to come up with something complete. So, I've been used to doing it, but I've not been used to seeing other people doing it. So, that was something important I felt needed to be addressed.
And as you mentioned, Jake, too, when it comes to the 6 steps, as you mentioned, of kind of Solomonic technique, as you say, there is, and tell me if I'm phrasing this right, that there is a flow, there is an initial consecratory process. There's, perhaps an invocation, then an evocation, then having an oath be present, and then a specific charge, and then a license to depart. But what you're saying is it's not as cut and dry, and that there is a lot of flexibility, and there is a lot of room for individual idiosyncratic approaches that may work for you better than another person, and it's up to the individual magician to put those pieces together. Would that be somewhat fair?
Yeah. I mean, I've had in my head for decades a standard license to depart, and it may not belong textually and historically speaking in the same strand of literature. I mean, that frame of words isn't used in this Solomonic grimoire that led to this one, that led to that one. But you can find that, find it serving this precise same purpose in other grimoires, like the Grimoire in Verum, for instance. There's not much difference between Crowley's standard license to depart and the Grimoire in Verum one. They're quite similar. I've never been short of a license to depart. I mean, just inserting those components in the right place in the appropriate order. You can reconstruct rituals entirely if there's bits missing, or just because there's bits you want to change. I don't find Solomonic conjurations particularly stimulating. I mean, people will argue that inflame yourself with prayer isn't a grimoire injunction, but I find it more effective when there is a bit of inflaming going on. And the language of some invocations is much more passionate than others. Someone forgot to tell the author of the Pictrix that invocations are meant to be dull.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely, Jake. And can you give us some of the broad strokes about, all right, there might be a listener out there saying, I hear what Jake's saying. I look forward to picking up my own copy of the book. When it comes to the hundreds of grimoires out there, modern grimoires, renditions of previous grimoires, classic quote unquote grimoires from hundreds of years ago. What are the key things that you look for, Jake, and what are the key things that you do to reconstruct or reforge a grimoire? If you have 5 grimoires in front of you and you're taking parts and reforging and looking at things, how do you do that?
Generally, for quite some considerable time, I work within the framework of the Grimoire Baron rather than with Olympic Spirit, although there are certainly connections. And that's already solved a few of the problems for me and for other people. For instance, if you don't want to use a whole lot of biblical names and quotations and such like, well, Grimoire Baron doesn't do much of that anyway. A lot of the issues people have with particular grimoires or their stereotyped idea of the grimoires just aren't present in the Grimoire Baron to start with, or they're considerably diminished. And that said, on occasion I've wanted, for instance, to make a clay image or even a clay pot for ritual purposes. And there's no dedicated consecration process in the Grimoire Baron for that. There's a general purpose consecration, which you could certainly use. But in the Key of Solomon, for instance, there's a whole chapter on working with wax and clay. Segueing that into your preparation processes will extend what the Grimoire Baron can do in detail. And the liming pot, for instance, is a very important piece of pottery. And I feel, even if you're not sacrificing an animal that's going to need its skin cleaning, the pot is a useful thing to do. It is in the Key of Solomon process, essentially, for dealing with such materials, is a legit insert. Right? There's not even much discontinuity there. Grimoire Baron does overlap substantially with the Solomonic tradition. But it needn't. If, for instance, you are wishing to gather herbs for magical purposes, and my magic does involve a lot of material substances, then there are sections as far back as the PGM. There are ritual processes for collecting herbs. This is what you say as you walk around the plant, etc., etc. And that's very pagan in expression, but it's still something you would legitimately want to do in 21st century conjuring. So it's quite easy to absorb what you need into a main structure, like the Grimoire Baron, which is an extremely flexible ritual frame. But yeah, you can do it. You just pick a mix. I mean, people have to start somewhere. In my early days, I used the invocations from the Leiden papyrus a lot, and I still do use parts from the Leiden papyrus and from the PGM nowadays. My conjuration of the deputies, for instance, is extracted straight from the PGM. I don't use the exact same invocations that the Grimoire Baron does on every occasion. I mean, the conjuration of the deputies I use is very, very potent conjuration from the PGM. So, yes, slotting things in has always been part of my work, although I found over time with the Grimoire Baron, some of the changes I've made have fallen by the wayside, and I play it straight sometimes, because why shouldn't you?
On the one hand, you have to be innovative and, as you say, take things and kind of fit them in where they might exist in a particular ritualistic framework. But on the other hand, Jake, how do you then avoid, and I know that you talk about this in the book, how do you avoid going the other way, which is, Jake wants me to be innovative. No problem. I'm going to throw everything out and I'm going to use Vajrayana Yadamic names in a specific grimoire from Europe. How do you avoid going the other way where some people might be throwing the entire thing out?
Well, that kind of person already existed before I even thought of writing this book. I'm not going to change the fact that there are people who will do that. But if there's people who sincerely want to approach it in a more professional fashion, say, then the advice should be out there. And to an extent it is. I mean, books like The Goetia of Dr. Rudd, but they're huge books. You can't just stick them in your rucksack and learn magic while hitchhiking around Europe for 6 years, Whereas this you could. I mean, you can develop your experience. And yes, you will make mistakes, and sometimes things will fall flat, or sometimes the spirits will may even complain, but then you negotiate with them. Obviously, you learn to negotiate with them. I say, sorry about that. Next time I'll make sure there is a big fat red candle burning.
If we look at the last year alone, and you look at the Heptameron of 1559, and then all of a sudden there's this new research into the Elucidarium Necromantiae, you're seeing just all kinds of new information, and information where someone maybe has practiced, say, the Heptameron for years, but now there's new information, and then it's kind of up to the individual to say, okay, what works, what doesn't, what can I take from perhaps this manuscript versus that? I mean, it sounds like this process can happen all the time, really.
It can, and it can be enormously complicated or fairly simple. I mean, like writing a ritual frame in shorthand on the back of an envelope is perfectly feasible. But on the other hand, they're doing a mass comparison of several different related manuscripts, some of which don't even bear the same name, but obviously have content in common. Yeah, that can be done. And there are communities now, wonderful communities, you mentioned Anthony Nichols and so on, which are doing precisely that. And it's facilitated by the fact that people have learned to converse rather than compete, and to cooperate, and that the tradition itself matters, that you can do stuff for magic rather than always wondering what magic can do for you. And I think that's marvellous, and it's opening up territory which is beyond my knowledge. I don't know a great deal about the background of the Heptameron and getting into Arabic magic and so forth as well. You can't be an expert at everything, but very quickly you'll find out that you operate with what you want to operate with. And it can be simple or it can be complicated. I find great joy in following this Heptameron discussion, but I haven't got a great deal to contribute, even though there are points at which the GV and Heptameron streams have knocked into each other.
Oh, yes. Well, and I can certainly say, just following some of those groups as well, that your observations are absolutely vital in many cases, because you have that context from the grimoires and the rituals that you've been working with for decades as well. So I think it's wonderful to see exactly yourself and Hadley Nichols and Joseph Peterson, and kind of all this collaboration that's going on is just excellent. Jake, you mentioned earlier about the Olympic spirits and working with spirits that are here and now, as you say. Why did you decide to focus on these specific spirits, and what do most people misunderstand about the Olympic spirits? For example, are they spirits, meaning they're spirits from Mount Olympus?
Well, they're classified in the same way that the gods of the 7 days of the week are classified. 7 out of the 12 gods of Olympus got to rule over the planet. Although I suspect earlier on it was probably a set of Chaldean gods that was the prototype. But yeah, there are differences. The reason I prefer the Olympic spirits quite naturally and instinctively is because I've been thinking about the nature of spirits and of Goetia for quite some considerable time, and I've come to the conclusion that it does concern primarily the earth sphere and the upper atmosphere. We talk about the spirits of the air and the lord of the spirits of the air and so on, which at various points in time you can always find them as a discrete unit, as it were, whether it's the recent grimoires as late as the 18th century or going right back to ancient Greece. The Olympic spirits are Paracelsian. The arbitel from which a lot of the material in the Shrial grimoire is drawn, that's Paracelsian. I'm not saying Paracelsus wrote it. Paracelsian is like Solomonic. No, Solomon may not have written any of it, but Paracelsus did. He personifies a revolution in magical thinking, which for no good reason has been largely forgotten. We've reverted to the Kabbalistic magic that came before him through the Golden Dawn and so on. There's actually very little Kabbalah in the majority of grimoires, even though some of the grimoires are Jewish. So he thinks about spirits in a different way. Here and now, for instance, he talks about the Olympic spirits being the planetary gods in people, not out there above the moon, but down here, even penetrating our bodies and physical matter. They're here. It's a different ontological approach, and this is why it doesn't fit demons or angels terribly well. It's something else. I've been interested in the Paracelsian strand for a long time, and what we might call the Albertine strand, although I think some of that is actually rebelling against the real figure of Albertus Magnus rather than following in his footsteps. It's the physicality of Paracelsian thinking that the nymphs and sylphs and so forth are in the material world and even composed of matter, some different kind of matter from us, because their natural abode is in various elements which we don't live in, but still physical, and interacting with our bodies. I mean, it's a very different way of thinking about magic. It is not Gnostic as such. It's not Kabbalistic. It's extremely extensive. When you add the 4 elementals to the 7 Olympic spirits, you've got a complete classification for dealing with any mythology that we're entitled to look at, whether it's Christian or pagan or whatever, and seeing it in the terms of this ontology rather than trying to put ourselves in an ancient Greek or a Hebrew or another mindset that doesn't really suit us. So it's an ontological approach. And even Zeus, for instance, can be classified as the king of the Salamanders rather than as the son of particular older Greek gods or anything else. And it's a different way of classifying things, a different way of looking at things that doesn't have to take on board the whole mindset of an older grimoire, for instance. I find that appealing, basically.
I remember, for example, when Frater Acker was on the podcast, who I know that you've collaborated with as well. And he mentioned, spirits don't do Solomonic magic. Spirits don't do elemental magic. And that effectively it's approaching the spirits on their own terms. And that seems to be what you're doing here with the Olympic spirits, and the ritualistic framework is saying, hey, here is a system that has this malleability that you can work with almost any spirit in a specific way. Would that be somewhat fair?
Yeah. In the same way as you could say that Kabbalistic correspondences, with 32 bloody paths and so on, plus, that's an ontological system where you're saying, things come from here and, then it's initiated up there and so on, and things slot into these different places. Well, Paracelsian model is a lot simpler. 7 planetary energies, 4 elemental energies, and any folkloric spirit or mythological god or whatever can be understood in those much simpler terms. Out in the countryside rather than all in your head is another major difference. Where people assume the grimoires were done indoors, there's a lot more evidence that they were done out of doors. When it comes to incense, for instance, they talk about a brazier rather than a little thurible or a smoking handbag.
Can you share with listeners about some of the personal experiences that you found out in forging and reforging your own grimoiric practices? Because I think people, whatever you're willing to share, of course, I think people would really appreciate, hearing, hey, here's someone like Jake Stratton Kent, who has decades of experience. And yet by making those tweaks and adjustments and forging and reforging, finding specific efficacy improvements or specific augmentations that maybe weren't there before.
Well, it shouldn't be a one-sided thing. In the context of the Grimoire Baron, for instance, I started quite early on with some ideas about how I wanted to refashion it, reforge it. But I also made my initial contact with the guardian spirit of the Grimoire Baron, you might say, Skirlin, who is the intermediary with the rest of the spirits. And I ran my ideas past him in a big divination session. It was like, that's okay. Oh, hang on, I've got a much better idea here. And I had to be humble about it. So, actually, that is a much better idea. And I understand things a bit better for your suggestion. And then moving on to, that's okay. But pretty soon afterwards, there was something else, the spirit said, actually, I've got a better idea. Within terms of a simple system that I understood, but expressed in a better way. So, it's not a matter of imposing a script on the spirits that they're no more likely to respond to than one that's always telling them how evil they are, which I've also had on occasion. I've had the conversation with the spirit has included, and could you please not talk to us like that? And part of the script has got dropped forever after a few experiences like that. A polite license to depart rather than a shove off while I'm going to burn your sigil and all the rest of it. I've learned to be polite and to listen to the spirits. And often if there's been a magical crisis in the middle of a ritual, listening to the spirits has been the most effective way of sorting it out, usually. Thinking on your feet and listening to the spirits. Okay, all right, I'm going to take the ritual in this direction now because I can see why you're annoyed or why you're being uncooperative. And things calm down. You get to close the ritual without any further problems. It may take a little longer than you expected, that's all. So being flexible, it is vital. If you're always performing the same ritual, not really listening to the spirits or being aware of the different ways spirits can talk to you, things get frustrating. And when a crisis occurs, you've no idea what to do because, oh God, the spirits have gone off script. It's not, you can't be wooden about it. You get to a certain point, you have to be able to think on your feet, and having little bits of ritual text stacked away in the memory of the occasion, or some clue what people have done when this sort of thing has happened to them, that you can quickly put into operation yourself. That's vital. And I think grimoires, like painting by numbers, is not the way to go. Yeah, sometimes you have to take a step in the dark and just follow the procedure. And that's good. But I think in any deviation from a script, which is demonstrably incomplete in the first place, thinking that that's going to lead to problems, because you've changed things, like patched a hole. That's the wrong way to think. It's not going to be helpful if and when things actually start happening.
That's what I find so refreshing about your work, whether it's Geosophia or whether it's your current tome or the myriad of other things, is just challenging us to think about how can things be done differently? And I think this leads, Jake, into the next question, which is, what are some of the biggest things that people dismiss or perhaps gloss over in ritualistic or grimoiric preparation as well? For example, I know when it comes to multi-day purifications or little things like fasting, little quote unquote, very important things, or perhaps rushing an invocation. I mean, can you just share with us, in your decades of experience, what are some of the big things that people might gloss over that actually turn out to be really important?
Well, if people are skipping these things because they're inconvenient and so on, that's part of the modern mindset of wanting to get out far more than you're willing to put in. Fasting or periods of isolation and so on. It can be arranged in the modern world and have quite sensible thinking behind them. You don't want a lot of distracting thoughts in your head when you're trying to contact a spirit, and looking at your watch because you want to go and see your girlfriend later or whatever. No, you've got to put time aside. But beyond that, I think potentially one of the most problematic areas are things like the confession, that are actually part of the main ritual, not preparatory. Yeah, it's curious that Crowley stresses the confession and is meant to be a completely amoral black magician, do what thou wilt, don't bend the knee, etc. But when it comes to ritual, there are a couple of exceptions, which he emphasises massively, and the confession is one of them. People might mistake it for some kind of Christian slave gods kind of attitude, but it's not at all. I mean, you can find purification rituals, massive purification rituals, in completely pagan contexts, like theurgy, for instance. And there were Orphic purification rituals, there were Chaldean purification rituals, and humbling yourself in the initial stages before you set out to change the universe. Something you shouldn't dismiss too readily.
I know that Dr. Stephen Skinner, for example, has talked about in the PGM days with the Egyptian priests forbidden from eating fish or garlic, there's that physical aspect of, for instance, sensitivity to smell that spirits have. But what you're saying is, when it comes to the confession, is there an element of, hey, humbling yourself and purifying yourself, both physically, but also mentally or spiritually, if you will, is vital, because that can improve greatly the ability to exchange with the spirits in ritual. Can you just talk about some of the fundamentals of the confession and what that means? Well,
it's something people need to think about themselves quite deeply, and there's a relevant chapter in Magic and Theory of Practice. He does tend to over-allegorize the stages of ritual, in my opinion. He still does a good enough job of telling you why they're in the process. But we're not always sure which spirits we're attracting. We're not even sure for real if the spirits we're attracting had the names we're giving them before they arrived. And various grimoire writers and people like Agrippa and whatnot, you talk about ensuring the best kind of spirits arrive and take on the names you want to give them and so on. And I think there's a strong element of truth in that. You want to not only for the spirit to be cooperative and responsive and calm rather than frightening and so on. You also want it to believe in, for instance, the names of power that you use. They have to mean something to you as well as the spirit. Your sincerity counts. And there's things like this in the Paracelsian tradition, which are quite illustrative. And in my grimoire, and in several other grimoires, you find this text called the Prayer of the Salamanders. And it's not a prayer to call the Salamanders, it's a prayer the Salamanders know and use themselves. You are appealing to their own religiosity, if you like, the spirituality of spirits, and that you share it. You share the same spirituality as they have. And thus, a spiritual might lead some other person to be a worse individual, will be more cooperative. And you and the spirit can grow spiritually through the interaction. This is all part of the thinking of conjuration. And it's often emphasized more in one place than another. I still think everyone should read the Come Together there for a start. But yeah, we should be sharing a degree of spirituality with the spirits. And this is why the word conjures there in the first place. It means to swear together. This process and its frame means something to you as well as to the spirits. And yeah, that might sound a bit religious, and I'm afraid in some ways it is. I have become a better person for dealing with spirits and passing tests which they've put upon me, which could have gone one way or the other. And it is a dangerous process if this isn't well understood.
We also, Jake, to that exact point, have a question from Glitch Bottle patron Kevin Carlo, who is asking, Jake, as someone who's worked with spirits for some time, do you think the occasional blowback from workings is karmic balancing, or do the entities just have their own agendas? I believe the latter, but I'm open to being convinced. You rock, Kevin Carlo says.
Well, he's absolutely right. Karmic blowback is bullshit. Karma doesn't play any role whatsoever in the thinking of traditional magics in the so-called West. If you perform the ritual correctly, then certain results will follow. That's the thinking. It's how a ritual is efficacious. If performed correctly, any lapses, if things go wrong, it's assumed in the traditional thinking that there's been a lapse in the ritual. You've done something incompletely, or you've omitted something, or possibly you've simply offended the spirit. And I must say this has happened to me very rarely. I can think of maybe 2 occasions where there's been quite serious repercussions in connection with a ritual which has recently been performed, or even in the midst of a ritual. Things I couldn't actually deal with at the time, things I had to recover from. And the first one of them was simply because I got out of my depth. I was taking on a target who was far more powerful and better protected than I was. And yeah, the magic had nowhere else to go but back on me. One of my early hard lessons was, if someone has a bunch of magical bodyguards, as proved by the Swiss police eventually, and is actually practicing black magic themselves with a bunch of professionals who are well equipped and financed, well, yeah, your sincerity won't count for shit. And yeah, the magic's got to go somewhere. The force you put in motion has got to go somewhere, and back to you is quite a simple route. So yeah, that wasn't karmic blowback. That was magical, and that magical reasons why it worked out that way. So a raw young witch was taking on someone who was actually much more professional and had a magical crew to boot. On another occasion, when I was much more involved with Grimoire and Verum, things had been going very well for a long time, working with 2 out of the 3 chiefs, or with their spirits to be more accurate. And I assumed it was going to go just as easily with the 3rd chief when I eventually needed to go there. And he was a much less forgiving frame of reference. Working with him didn't go so well the first time at all. Possibly as much as 6 months later, I was still feeling the effects. But that's out of years of practice, and it was educational. Yeah. But it's nothing to do with karma whatsoever. Some spirits are very strict about protocols, and you have to know that sometimes there's exceptions to the protocols. When some people say they can conjure a spirit with a candle and a glass of water, but I can think of at least one spirit who hates water. It's a deeply offensive thing to offer, let alone sprinkle in his direction. So yeah, you may have a process that works works consistently for years, and suddenly you hit a speed bump. Because you've got into another part of the system and you're getting a bit happy-go-lucky. Nothing to do with karma.
Not confusing karmic blowback, quote unquote, with magical blowback. I mean, for example, if we think about a blacksmith and someone who's working at a forge, well, if you burn yourself or if something spills over and causes a fire, for example, that's not karmic blowback as much as it is blowback of working day to day in a specific trade and practice, as you say, in a technological practice. And sometimes stuff goes wrong, but that's not karmic blowback.
Not at all. Karma was sort of imported into the occult revival by the Theosophical Society. Previously, it had no part in really traditional conjure practice, folk practice. But the whole frame of reference of magic is, if you get the process right, then things are going to go hunky-dory. I think no karma involved. And sometimes, yes, I think perhaps we need to think about our personal morality. Yes, very much so. But magic is ultimately amoral and a technology.
As well, Jake, you just mentioned a moment ago, you can think of one spirit that absolutely hates water. If I were to bet, I would say that description of the specific particularities of that spirit was not found in a grimoire per se under a list of the Office of Spirits, but that was something that you found working with spirits, year after year with direct experience. Can you just talk about how important it is that even if someone may look over a register of spirits and the offices of spirits, those are a really good guide, but the actual specific particularities of a spirit are revealed or exchanged with in ritual itself, as opposed to looking in a grimoire.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do, is in the ritual frame, have a conversation with the spirits. I mean, that's part of the procedure. And there are formalities, for instance, in the grimoire in Barum, when you're first contacting a spirit, it's polite to offer frankincense. But some of them do have other preferences. You're just observing initial formalities. They may give you different advice to follow in future. And so, frankincense is fine, but given my nature, maybe some sandalwood or a whole concoction, maybe some herbal ingredients, and may also depend on why you're working with the spirit and in what mode you're working with the spirit. There may be correspondences which aren't about them so much as how you're working. The Bohemian stars, for instance, have sigils which are involved in spirit magic, which I do employ. And when you're working with spirit that way, there's a batch of correspondences to those stars. But you look at them, and I can't remember how many of it out of 15 it is. It's somewhere around 50%. Mugwort is in the rest of it. So mugwort is something to do with working with star spirits. It's not a correspondence of just one spirit. So, you want to work with them in this particular way, then mugwort, and best to have some mandrake on hand as well. Works them, half of them. So that's to do with the procedure rather than being a correspondence of the spirit. The water example, though, that's not from goetic practice, in fact, although it may as well be. That's part of the Kimbanda universe, and some that work with entities in common with the Kimbanda universe. There's a particular spirit there who really doesn't like water, and the appropriate offering is white wine. But then this is a more developed and living tradition, so they've got more worked out about how to operate this particular spirits rather than a catalogue of spirits. And water wouldn't naturally be offered to that spirit. In fact, quite the opposite. But we must expect similar things to occur with the spirit catalogue. In GB practice, I use frankincense for the initial offering. First time I meet that spirit, and I think of it as a polite formality, and they understand it because they've been around the grimoire and Barum for longer than I have. It's like, we know what you're doing. You're being polite, but some of us like something a little more complicated.
And that's why it's so wonderful, reading the Sworn and Secret Grimoire and really hearing, Jake, about you sharing and challenging readers and listeners to do exactly that, to forge and reforge and explore different traditions and find out what works in your own practice. And to that point, we have a question from JT Lopez, who is asking, Jake, how does the modern Solomonic magician go about collecting new registers of original spirits and in turn compiling them into a grimoire?
Yeah, that's not as difficult as it might sound. As I say, part of the structure of these rituals, when we talk about the confession, is attracting good spirits. You can follow the instructions for example, another kind of spirit in the fourth book, where it's not talking about evil spirits, not talking about angels or anything, so another kind of spirit, which are essentially nature elementals. And these are much more related to the grimoire tradition than people might think. And the process is just to go out into the countryside where spirit, the right kind of countryside for the types you want to speak to, or just the kind of countryside you've got, and see who's available. I mean, there's a ritual process for attracting spirits. Key of Solomon's not too different, actually. No spirits are really named in most versions of the Key of Solomon. You're attracting the spirits who are local and trying to find one who will cooperate and do the thing you want to do. But yeah, obtaining a new spirit register is not technically difficult, and you can definitely see it being done on occasion. Quite a few processes of crystalmancy aren't too different, although they're much more indoors. But yeah, you're calling spirits who may be around in the astrological conditions or in the natural environment that you're working with. Unnamed spirits, see who comes and talk to them. Yeah, so it's absolutely feasible.
And I think this relates to a listener question we have from Douglas from What Magic Is This, who's asking, how does Jake feel about something like RRH's The Little Key to the True Grimoire from Hadean Press? Does having something that can handhold a bit through the process of interacting with a grimoire benefit things, Douglas is asking, or is something lost in the quote-unquote figuring it out for yourself method?
I have mixed feelings about this, and sometimes just following the script and possibly having a helping hand doing that is definitely going to be useful. But on the other hand, you've got to cultivate independence and thinking on your feet. So yeah, I do have mixed feelings like that, but I wouldn't be inviting primers if I wanted to figure out everything for themselves. I mean, making people reinvent the wheel isn't a good way to go about things. So yeah, I do think we overdo our reliance on, say, forums on the internet and so on. You have a lot of beginners all in one place. Some of them aren't being honest about perhaps about their level of involvement in the past, and trusting or thinking, well, I don't want to do things that these people don't approve of. Everybody says you've got to do this, but my grimoire or my intuition or whatever is going the other way, but I'm going to repress that because my peer group disagrees. Or they think such and such a grimoire is silly and you ought to be working with such and such another one. All of that is rubbish. Peer group pressure in magic can be very, very unhelpful. You don't need to figure out problems for yourself. Well, it's going to be helpful because there's going to be problems.
I believe when it comes to specific people who, as you say, maybe they're following the group, or maybe they're being disingenuous about what they've actually accomplished in ritual. I believe you coined a term for this kind of mentality, which is the dark fluff bunny mentality, which is I, casually mention on a forum about how I summoned Belial with a snap of my fingers and a candle and a glass of water. And this is what I ordered this powerful demon to do. And I believe that was you who first coined this. And I know I've shared this with this kind of dark fluff bunny mentality, which is only to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that, look, these operations do exist. Of course, this is a very serious thing and you need to approach it with sincerity, but there might be a tendency, especially online, to be disingenuous or amplify or to exaggerate something that maybe you didn't really experience at all. Can you share about that?
Well, I mean, the main problem is it turns into people going around in circles and nothing actually moves forward. Spend more time talking about magic and worrying about whether you're doing it right because such person says something else. That's all futile. But yeah, posturing's not terribly helpful either. By any traditional mainstream definition, what I do is black magic. I don't have to go around saying, "Hey, everyone, I'm a black magician." Well, X and Y and Z cultural strands would define my manual, my approach, and so, etc. as black magic. But those cultural traditions aren't necessarily authoritative. I mean, maybe cultural traditions we're meant to be trying to break with. So it's ultimately meaningless whether it's black or white. in somebody's eyes, it's a bit of a boost. I saw a B-movie the other day, and Kurt Russell was playing the villain, and he had this big black car with some big skull-type motif on the bonnet, and he says, we want to impress people, scaring them is an easy way to do it, so I went for that. Yeah, and it is easy, but what does it actually achieve? My interest has been, for a very long time, to advance the tradition, to revitalise it, or at least contribute to the revitalisation, and be a bit humble about tradition and care about it. And at the same time, not every magical operation I do is to wipe someone off the face of the earth. I do things to help people quite often. Sometimes that involves someone getting hurt. But yeah, making a big pose about it doesn't help anyone. It certainly doesn't help magic. And yeah, I care more about leaving my tradition in better shape than I found it than I do about blowing my own trumpet. I wish that attitude was more general. It surprises me that it isn't. Yeah.
And that's something, Jake, that you've consistently done for years, which is illuminating the past, building on the tradition, and having other magicians. I know Frater Acker, for example, talking in his Clavix Goetica, that, building on your work, your amazing work that you've done with Geosophia, the Argo of Magic. And so I think this tradition about looking at previous work, modifying it, building on it, magicians collaborating, leads to this next question for you from Glitch Bottle patron Benjamin Shaw, who's asking, Jake's writings from the 1980s and 1990s, as outlined in Hadean Press's Magnus Dictus, seem a lot more, quote unquote, classically thelemic than his current work. To what extent does Jake see crossover or value in his older work on Thelema and English Kabbalah to the present day?
Well, there are certainly some strands in that material which we've been discussing today. The skeletonic ritual structure, and that's part of the Magnus Dictus pamphlet. And you can see me doing stuff with that in the late 80s, early 90s. Actually, it goes back to my earlier life in the 70s. There are strands, but a lot of the more thelemic externals, I don't bother with now. But that doesn't mean they weren't useful to me in the past. I think, for instance, the AA curriculum can be done fairly much solo, and it's a good training system. There's things like visualization exercises and so on. I think too easily dismissed, but putting yourself through that discipline is going to be helpful. But I found it so, even if I have dropped a lot of the external since. As for English Kabbalah, well, I don't like talking about it too much. I spent 16 years talking about it as its primary spokesman, and there was a lot of aggro involved. I mean, that might seem classically Thelemic, but a lot of classical Thelemites were really, really opposed to the very concept. It was helpful to me, and in my developing my relationship with the Grimoire Invariant Spirits, in the past I've used Kabbalistic processes, English Kabbalistic processes. They're not strictly Kabbalah at all. It's just a name that I didn't give the system in the first place. But yeah, if you can use EQ, in my opinion, for devising or finding magical names, for instance, to replace the Hebrew or quasi-Hebrew ones, not difficult. You've got a numerical code which can classify words or names numerically, which will then fit into an astrological framework, which is pretty much what I did. I sort of worked out a system of planetary and other names using EQ, and being pretty strict about where I got the names from. They had to come out of the so-called Thelemic holy books whenever possible. But yeah, I did a lot of that. I imagine it might be called Kabbalistic, but I prefer it had another name, and in fact, using appropriate names does have other names. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, talked about praise names. These were names and words of power which were appropriate to the ritual of a particular god. Still find traces of that in the PGM. Figure out which names of power you ought to be using with which deity. Not on quite a few occasions, yet collect the names appropriate to Typhon. You'll find them in every ritual that ever mentions him. There's also traces of what the editor calls Kephra theology in the PGM. So yeah, concept of holy names is something, or of name, words of power, or whatever you want to call them, can absolutely be approached through EQ, and I have quite extensively. But as I say, some of the initial changes I made to the GB process with such tools have since fallen by the wayside, and to a large extent, I play it straight or have less need for a formal structure in the first place because I've already made the pacts. So I don't have to repeat the first introduction process that people think is what Grimoire magic is. I've got simpler processes for working with those spirits as a condition of the various pacts. Can we do this simpler next time? Say, something that takes 20 minutes, like this. Oh, no, you don't like that, but we'll change that. Right. Like that, yeah, fine, we're good. It's all part of the negotiation process, which you can find references to in classical literature all the time. Being able to think on your feet and work it out and remember the right kind of questions, all part of the practice. But it's a tool I've used extensively in the past, perhaps in manners that haven't been given as much exposure in America particularly. A lot of their EQ information is secondhand. But why not? I just don't expect me to talk about it very much in future.
When it comes to those traditions too, Jake, I know in Geosophia, for example, you trace, in such detail, this incredible history connecting to the roots of Goetic practice in the misty past and illuminating that for us. And I think that leads to this next question we have from Glitch Bottle patron Stephen Civadelic, who's asking, "Hey, Jake, lovely to see you back on Glitch Bottle. I eagerly await for your new book to arrive, and I'm sure it will, like your other works, pierce into the very depths of Goetic magic itself, which is exceedingly important in the type of traditional witchcraft I and my coven practice." And Stephen's saying, "My question to you, Jake, is in regards to the great goddess Nyx, or Night, whose many children, including the Fates, Nemesis, Styx, Charon, and Thanatos, reside in Tartarus and the underworld. Clearly, these, Stephen says, are the primordial gods, possibly more ancient than the Titans themselves." And he's asking, Jake, what are your thoughts about these primordial divine powers? And do you think that they play an important role in Goetic practice?
The short answer is yes, but that's not very helpful. I think we can get confused in the search for primal gods. And take some references to literally, and not this question though. Yeah, something older even than the Titans, and the Titans are something that comes from a very Olympian perspective, of course. So in Geosophia, I have underneath the philosophical veneers of Platonism and so forth, which wasn't current when the myths were formed. And yes, you can even trace developments or changes in Greek mythology over time. Zeus is the king of the gods, for instance. There are periods and places where that is not the case, where Poseidon and Demeter were the chief god and goddess. And Poseidon has as many underworld connections as he does aquatic ones, which is overemphasized in the later period because he's not chief god anymore. Deities like Necessity and Nemesis and so forth are frequently mentioned in the PGM, and indeed you'll bump into them in Geosophia as well. There is an older level of religious thought which is quite different. And as we were talking about earlier, how Paracelsian physicality in the spirit world differs from our ideas that spirits are somehow ethereal and that we can only lend them a body at best. It's obviously not current in old mythic thinking. The gods are always interacting with human beings in various ways, even sex. Whether that actually happened or not isn't relevant. It's how they thought about things was physical, not ethereal. It was concerned this world, not some other world. And you could see in Norse mythology, for instance, with the Norns or weird sisters, a direct parallel with this older level of Greek mythology, but minus any transcendental veneer on top of it. Because good on them, the Norse didn't develop a Plato. They didn't have one. So you can see the mythological framework, which is much more physical and interactive with our world, rather than the gods are distant and think they're squeezed now. I find this very hard to talk about because so many other people find it hard to think about. It's a non-transcendental approach is native to mythology. In the first place, it's native to mythology, and just as native to lots of layers of traditional magic. We don't have to think in this post-Christian, with traces of Platonism that Western culture has given our brains, whether we're aware that our brains work that way or not. We do have to break down that kind of conditioning. And I found that my magic work had broken it down for me. And also my research for Geosophia, I thought, hang on, these Kabbalistic and Platonic patterns don't work. They're not that old, and they don't think the same way. So when reassessing the deeper levels of the oldest levels of Galicia and mythology, I just found those models a bad fit. But explaining that to people sometimes is very difficult, and it's good to have a question that seems to have already thought about. Thank you for that.
Jake, this really highlights someone like yourself who's had decades of experience, and also someone who has so many different other interests and experiences too. And this leads directly into a listener question we have from the great Meredith Graves, who is asking, Jake Stratton Kent returning to the podcast is the best news ever. I totally agree with you, Meredith. And Meredith is saying, knowing Alexander often reads these comments verbatim, I will spare him a ludicrous fangirling monologue and get to the question. You've spoken before across media and platforms about your engagement with both the magic and the punk scenes in their early days, but I'd love to know more about where those two paths intersected for you then and since. How did you become the punkest person alive? Or rather, what, if anything, about punk rock has informed your magic?
Oh, I could talk for a long time about what punk did for me. Well, perhaps I should. I was a street kind of person as a teenager when Dark Side of the Moon came out, and prog rock just started to turn me off big time. And I could remember these tunes I'd heard as a kid by Little Richard and so on, so things I'd heard on the radio. And I thought, I got to go and look deeper into that. And I started buying old blues and old rock and roll records. And then punk came along. And I thought, this is what I've been waiting for. And I just responded to it big time because the bands like the Ramones and so on, they understood the perfect rock and roll track. 2 minutes, 30 seconds, well, maybe even shorter is okay. So it appealed to me big time. And around, this is a very niche British context I'm speaking now, obviously. Chaos Magic came to be just about the same time as punk rock was getting big. And some of the early editorials in the New Equinox magazine, which preceded Chaos International, talked about getting punk with magic, like a bunch of kids can just get an amp and some guitars with very little experience in music and get a band together. And why shouldn't we have a more spontaneous and similarly spontaneous approach to magic? And I found that refreshing, even though I've always had a deep interest in tradition as well. I have occasionally been described as going punk rock on someone or something. Yeah, natural irreverence. It doesn't have to be done that way. We don't have to look up to people noodling away on their guitars or on their 19th century theosophy and Kabbalah. We can overturn all that, but we will, I think, inevitably find what we might call archetypal patterns we will end up following, but which they had maybe started off following but lost some time ago. Revitalizing things doesn't always mean changing them completely, and sometimes you cannot help bringing back or contacting a pattern that is much older than yourself. Maybe it's been talking to several cultures over time, I don't know. But yeah, you work with what looks like a new frame and find it starts speaking to you in language you can find in old mythologies and stuff as well. Maybe it's actually much harder than we will think to totally reinvent magic. Things will reassert themselves. If you're going about things in a sincere fashion, you might get nudged in the right direction by spirit contact or whatever. And yet people may think you're crazy sometimes doing what you're doing, but someone would anyway. Punk rock is doing what you want to do, whether it's fashionable or not, very much so. And the focus is on the individual. And that's also true of Goetia. If you trace the original word back, Goetia is something that a Goeth does. It takes its name from the operator rather than the other way around. Magic is something a magician does. He's taking his name from magic. But with Goetia, it's very much the other way around. The Goess possesses their own intrinsic qualities which are powerful. It's not necessarily purely God-given or bestowed temporarily. It's something that, from your own inner sources, that enables you to do Goetia. And I think that's very punk. The emphasis is on the individual rather than on authority.
To follow Meredith's question, Jake, when you mentioned that there are so many different ways that spirits can speak to you, I know Meredith's spoken before on the podcast about patterns and recognizing that, hey, this is something that's being communicated to me, and it's maybe in a way that I never thought this would be considered a specific way that you could get a communication. So are you kind of saying that when it comes to punk and when it comes to music and genres and getting into different aspects of this, that people need to be open about receiving messages perhaps in ways that they might not even have been aware of at first?
Oh, yeah, that has certainly happened to me in a couple of relevant examples. Quite early on in my magical life, I got very tranced out while using a drum, and it was literally not just me talking with the drums. You heard about talking drums, but it was talking back. I mean, this was, a communication. And I'm not going to call it shamanic or anything of the kind, but I got tranced out with the drum. It was a conversation with spirits that was telling me things and giving me, how would you describe it? But yeah, there was a particular rhythm or a particular sequence of sounds that for a long time would trigger experiences, or I'd start hearing it. We might think there's no music in the grimoires, but that's not strictly true. The ancestor of the grimoire Verum, the Secrets of Solomon, describes rituals accompanied by music. The lyre and the whistle, but I don't see why the lyre shouldn't be a guitar, and the whistle shouldn't be a flute, and I don't see why it shouldn't be extended to drums. I've certainly incorporated drums in rituals since in a more formal pattern. War drums, for instance, during an invocation of Horus on otherwise very traditional lines. And I don't see why that shouldn't be experimented with. But more specifically, there's a tool which I've not found mentioned in the grimoires so far. I mean, finding the lyre and the whistle were, as Joseph Peterson did, that was great. And that confirmed what I felt was all right, but didn't have any traditional grounds for, not in the grimoire period at that time. But another tool I use extensively is the pendulum. And as far as I'm aware, that does not turn up in the grimoire literature. It was recommended, I think, back in the 90s by Jason S. Black and Christopher Hyatt in a couple of manuals at that time. And I've never looked back since I started using the pendulum, and I found it very easy to incorporate into grimoire frames. I mean, you're having a conversation with someone, you've got a pendulum in your hand, and communication will start to happen. The divination, it's a divination tool, and divination was always about talking to gods or talking to the spirits. So most means of divination, it's very easy to involve two parties, one of which isn't human. Cyprianic cartomancy is a very good example. There's it involves an invocation of Cyprian, and it is essentially a conversation with Cyprian, and there's storylines because it's cartomancy, it also generates text almost automatically, and storylines which concern your life but also the life of Cyprian, because there's mythic interaction going on there. So divination tools for talking to spirits, I absolutely recommend, whether the grimoires mention them or not.
This is the first volume, the Sworn and Secret Grimoire in the Night School. Can you share about any future projects, updates, or other areas of interest or future topics that you'd like to see explored in the Night School series? And I know that you touched on it a little bit before, but is there anything else that you'd like to, share with listeners or leave listeners with about future engagements?
Oh, well, Night School 2 is already very much in progress, and it will be a larger book. As I said earlier, in some ways, Sworn and Secret Grimoire is a preparation for it. If you're familiar with the processes in there, you'll be ready to do something more experimental with Volume 2, because that is part of how I framed the whole thing. Is magicians should be researching and experimenting rather than just painting by numbers. And I'll put the ball very much in the reader's court. in volume 2 with stuff that is under-researched and under-experimented with in the grimoire tradition. Even the late grimoire tradition, there's stuff that we have missed, which is fairly, I'm talking about almost the entire occult revival for its entire history from 1875 we've been missing. People need to take up, as it were, and develop. And this also goes back to the question about spirit registers, meeting new spirits. And they don't even have to be new spirits entirely. There are spirit catalogues that we have not explored. Everyone wants to talk about just 72 spirits and miss all the others out. Now, there are spirits who probably haven't been conjured in centuries in some of these registers. And I'd encourage people, I think it's much more interesting to go into those areas and discover new things that extend our knowledge. So, yeah, and volume 2 is about stuff I've been researching for a long time, but this isn't a cut and dried, I've done it all, just do what I say approach at all. I'll be laying out the materials in a very coherent fashion. So, spirit registers, lunar mansions, appropriate sigils, etc., etc. Here's somebody you haven't heard of who's actually the author of this stuff you think you know about, but was actually refashioned by the next guy in line. That sort of thing. Going back into texts which haven't even been translated yet, which can be got round in various ways, and being ingenious about how to get around things is another part of the process. That's volume 2 in a lot of ways. This is not a cut and dry painting by numbers approach. It's something you've got to explore for yourself. I haven't finished exploring it in my life, but it has revolutionized my approach to magic in many ways. It ties a lot of strands together, which people will have come across at various points in my works before. And yeah, I've sometimes been too concise and trying to rectify that a bit in this book and systemize some strands. But yeah, I'm systemizing them to make it possible to take further in a more convenient and simple fashion. There will still be work to do themselves. That's inevitable. We've seen in the past as simple a process as grimoire and Baron. It's simple in probably the Middle East, most of Europe and the UK. It gets a bit more difficult in America just because people can't find hazel trees everywhere. So, yeah, there's always going to be a need to go out into your own environment and look at things that are maybe only slightly different from the thing that's turned you onto it. But some of the changes aren't inevitable and you have to make them. And, yeah, you do a little bit more research and you find out, why is the elder rod an elder rod rather than hazel? And find other examples in the grimoires where it's not an elder rod, it's another wood which has a similar property to elder wood, which is that it can be hollowed out. And you may not be able to find elder trees, but you can probably find bamboo or another wood that is easily hollowed out and do maybe some of the jobs that such a tube did in the past. But yeah, I don't do cut and dried. And I don't do potted systems, and I'm going to do it even less in the next volume.
There have been so many great observations that you've shared based on questions from the Glitch Bottle patrons. And I am so thankful for the Glitch Bottle patrons for their support of the podcast. And I want to let everyone know as well, Jake, they can support you on Patreon, patreon.com/Jake Stratton Kent. Can you just give listeners a little bit of a preview of what are some of the things that you share with your patrons and your supporters that they can enjoy supporting you on Patreon with?
Well, yeah, as you might expect from some strands, it's irreverent and anarchistic, but also very hands-on, and it's not dismissing traditional materials at all. Quite the contrary. I'm more involved with traditional magic than ever, and some of the themes I explore, people have no idea that they are traditional in the first place. So yeah, it's a mix of the traditional and the irreverent. People might get previews of material that have taken way too long to publish. Yeah, there's been early drafts of stuff that's going into future books, and occasional excerpts from older stuff, old posts that turn up in my Facebook memories, and I think, oh God, that was a throwaway item. It doesn't have to be. And I occasionally copy some of those to Patreon. But yeah, some of the stuff I ramble about for years without actually publishing a book. I'd like to share files with interested parties, then Patreon's a good way of doing that. So people don't have to wait for me to finish writing the book. They can maybe start doing some exploring and research in the meantime. And I'm very grateful to my Patreon supporters, just about financially independent. So although that as part of the couple, between the two of us, I'm able to be a full-time writer as much as I want to be. And I'm very grateful to my readers and to our patrons for that.
Is there anything else, Jake, that you'd like to leave listeners with about either the Sworn and Secret Grimoire from Hadean Press that we haven't discussed yet, or just anything else that comes to mind that you'd like to leave listeners and magicians and anyone else listening with?
Well, as I say, the talismanic process described in there is very, very similar, as indeed talismanic operations are in general. They're very similar to conjuration processes. So if you don't feel ready for conjuring, talismanic work will still teach you how to do it. There's only a couple of points of which the process varies at all. So work with the Petit Albert talismans or the form of them which I've given you here. Experiment with the incenses. And if you think another set of planetary incenses are more appropriate to you, well, by all means, experiment with them. But the result doesn't meet your expectations, maybe go back to the suggested ones. But yeah, work with them. It's not a difficult process. You don't have to follow the original Christian script that closely, and that is all discussed in the book. It's what other sources are available that are perfectly legitimate and related, because these strands have run in parallel for a long, long time. So there may be Christian strands, there may be Jewish strands, but equally there are Greek and Egyptian strands and Chaldean strands that have all been knitted together at various points in time and can be reintroduced without really disturbing the fabric at all, because they fit just as well as the Christian did. So don't be too put off that I've included some of the original grimoire material, or feel that can restrict you necessarily. But yes, certainly experiment with it, and you'll be all the more ready for volume 2 if you do.
Magician, author, scholar, grimoiric firebrand Jake Stratton Kent. His new book is the Sworn and Secret Grimoire from Hadean Press. Jake, as always, I'm so thankful for your time. Thank you for taking the time and sharing your wisdom on the podcast today.
No, it's been a pleasure.
So I remember the first time that I had the honor to speak with Jake Stratton Kent, because Jake, those many years ago, was one of the first guests on the Glitch Bottle podcast. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that, this is the 100th Glitch Bottle episode? I was sharing with a few Patreon supporters that I cannot even believe the journey that we've been on and how much that I've learned along the way and continue to learn from listeners, patrons, and these incredible guests like Jake Stratton Kent, and the journey is just beginning. It is such an honor to have Jake stop by the podcast and share his wisdom. There are so many things that Jake touched on. I really appreciated how Jake really strikes that balance between exploring new ways to reforge a grimoire to suit one's own practice, but also maintaining the key elements of a ritualistic procedure or an operation, and also bringing together elements of different grimoires or practices to show fidelity to the overall method, but while adhering to an overall method, let's say, not being afraid ever to experiment, to explore, and to make magical practice our own. So a big thanks to Jake Stratton Kent for sharing his time and wisdom. Definitely make sure to consider supporting Jake on Patreon. And also a huge thank you to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your support and your questions and your insights, which are all so important to keeping the podcast engines running and taking the show in new and interesting directions. And if you, yes, I am speaking to you right now, I actually live inside your podcast app, so they won't let me out until I say this. If you'd like to play a direct role in supporting the podcast with exclusive perks, you can also become a Glitch Bottle patron on patreon.com/glitchbottle. And you can always listen to Glitch Bottle on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.